The wheel stood in the center of the square, silent, splintered, stained with blood long since dried. People gathered, not to help, but to watch. A man knelt beside it, praying, knowing his bones would soon be shattered, one by one. But why? What kind of justice demands you die in pieces? Throughout history, few methods of execution have matched the sheer savagery of the breaking wheel. Known in various regions as the Catherine wheel, this device became infamous across medieval Europe as a legal punishment for some of the most severe crimes. But the use of the wheel wasn't limited to kings and courts. It became a tool of public theater, fear, and religious authority. Its legacy is one of bones shattered, crowds cheering, and justice turned into spectacle. The breaking wheel wasn't invented in a vacuum. Like most tools of cruelty, it evolved alongside civilization's desire to control, humiliate, and destroy those it labeled dangerous. The origins of the breaking wheel can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome, where criminals could be bound to wooden frames and beaten to death or left for the elements. But it was in medieval and early modern Europe where this punishment found its most terrifying form, institutionalized, ritualized, and normalized. The idea was both simple and horrifying. A criminal would be tied to a large wooden wheel, sometimes a cartwheel or a specially constructed frame. Their limbs were stretched out, tied to the spokes or placed on blocks underneath. Then, with a heavy iron bar or hammer, the executioner would systematically break each major bone in the criminal's body, usually starting from the legs and working upward. But this was not merely a quick death. In many documented cases, the intention was to keep the victim alive for as long as possible. The executioner, acting on precise instructions from judges or religious authorities, would avoid striking vital organs. They would shatter arms and legs but leave the chest intact, ensuring that death would come slowly, sometimes over hours or even days. The legal justification for the wheel varied. In many parts of the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Eastern Europe, it was reserved for crimes considered especially horrific: murder, robbery with violence, heresy, or high treason. But there were no guarantees. Local magistrates had broad discretion, and what constituted a heinous crime could depend on religion, politics, or public mood. One of the most disturbing elements of the breaking wheel was its public nature. Executions weren't carried out in private. They were staged in town squares or at city gates, meant to serve as warnings to the population. Children were brought to watch. Food vendors set up stalls. Priests gave last rites, often while the condemned were already screaming in agony. Once the bones were broken, the executioner might weave the shattered limbs through the spokes of the wheel, creating a grotesque display of twisted human flesh. The wheel would then be hoisted onto a pole and left standing for days, even weeks, so that passing travelers could see what justice looked like. In some regions, this punishment was called breaking on the wheel, a phrase that became synonymous with total physical and spiritual destruction. In Germany, it was referred to as rädern, a verb meaning to wheel someone, and in France, la roue, the wheel, became one of the most feared words in criminal law. But the practice wasn't limited to the medieval era. Cases of breaking persisted well into the 18th century. In fact, one of the most detailed and horrifying records comes from 1757, when Robert François Damiens was executed in Paris for attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. While Damiens' punishment included drawing and quartering, the breaking wheel was used in earlier stages to prolong his suffering. Historical records also describe specific, graceful forms of the wheel. In certain cases, the condemned might be struck in the chest or neck early in the process, a form of mercy that would cause faster death. But even this so-called clemency was arbitrary. It depended on whether the court believed the criminal deserved a quick end. The psychological impact of the breaking wheel went beyond the victims. It shaped entire communities. The slow death, the screams, the visual horror, all of it functioned as a public ritual of control. It wasn't only about punishing the individual. It was about reinforcing the power of the state, the church, and the social order. People learned not only to obey the law but to fear what happened when they didn't. And in many cases, this fear was internalized as morality. The wheel became a symbol, a moral and physical deterrent, one that turned brutality into virtue. In a society governed by monarchs and faith, obedience was survival. The breaking wheel ensured that everyone understood what disobedience looked like, not in theory, but in blood and bone. The application of the breaking wheel followed a grotesque, calculated ritual that left little room for mercy. Every step was formalized. Nothing was random. The goal was to maximize pain while preserving life, at least for a while. Before the execution began, a sentencing court would often issue precise orders, not only for guilt or innocence, but also for how many blows the criminal would receive, which bones should be broken first, and whether a coup de grace, a mercy blow to the chest or neck, should be allowed at the end. The condemned was usually brought to the place of execution in chains, sometimes dragged behind a cart, sometimes walked under guard. Crowds would line the streets, whispering, spitting, jeering, or praying. When the criminal arrived, they would find the wheel already prepared, a large wooden structure, either lying flat on a platform or mounted on a pole. In most cases, the wheel was a common wagon wheel, sturdy, with thick wooden spokes and a broad rim. But executioners often modified the wheels for this specific purpose. Sometimes they reinforced the wood with metal strips or added grooves where ropes could be tied. In some cities, wheels were custom-built just for braking. The condemned was stripped, bound, and positioned. There were two primary methods of placement. In the first, known as the long cross position, the victim was tied down spread eagle, with arms and legs extended outward in a cruciform shape. Their limbs were laid over wooden blocks or metal rods placed beneath the major joints, ankles, knees, wrists, elbows. This was done to ensure that when the executioner delivered each blow, the bones would break cleanly, without dispersing the force. In the second method, the body was tied directly to the wheel itself, limbs threaded through the spokes or strapped across the rim. In both cases, the executioner had full control. The hammer, usually a heavy iron bar or cart axle, came down in a calculated rhythm. The traditional braking sequence varied by region, but a common pattern involved 8 to 10 blows, first the legs, then the arms, then the thighs and forearms. The joints were the primary targets. The goal was not to mutilate the body randomly, but to systematically render every limb useless. Execution manuals even included diagrams for blow order, with illustrations showing exactly where to strike for maximum damage and prolonged suffering. A skilled executioner knew how to avoid vital organs, how to fracture without killing, how to break someone slowly. The victim's screams filled the air, often accompanied by chants or prayers from nearby clergy. In some cases, if the condemned repented publicly, especially in religious heresy trials, the crowd might demand mercy. In others, if the crime was especially heinous, they might demand the torture be extended. In some towns, a ceremonial official, often a judge or bishop, would supervise the execution. They would observe each blow, ensuring that the sentence was being carried out exactly as prescribed. Deviating from the assigned number of blows or finishing the execution too quickly could result in punishment for the executioner himself. Once the limbs were shattered, the executioner might move on to the next phase, weaving the broken body into the wheel. This process, known as braiding, involved bending and twisting the limbs, now pliable and fractured, between the spokes of the wheel. Arms and legs were wrapped grotesquely around the frame, sometimes secured with ropes or nails. The body no longer resembled a human figure. It was a sculpture of pain. If a coup de grace had been authorized, the executioner would then strike a final blow to the chest or throat, crushing the sternum, the heart, or the windpipe. This was considered an act of mercy. In some regions, the executioner would first hold up a crucifix or ask for the victim's final words. But in many cases, the death blow was denied. The victim, bone shattered, was left alive on the wheel, bleeding and broken, hoisted into the air on a tall pole. There, exposed to sun, wind, rain, and scavenging birds, they would hang, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Some accounts describe victims surviving for over 24 hours after the final blow, conscious and moaning, until dehydration, blood loss, or exposure finally ended their agony. The wheel itself, now smeared with blood and flesh, stood as a warning. In many towns, these grisly displays became semi-permanent fixtures. Birds nested in the bones. Children grew up knowing exactly what had happened there. Sometimes, families were forbidden to retrieve the body. Other times, the bones were removed only after the full sentence of public display had been fulfilled. The remains might be burned, buried in unconsecrated ground, or left to rot. But the breaking wheel was not just a punishment. It was a message, not whispered in courts, but shouted across hills and marketplaces. It told the people that power did not forgive, that the state and the church had no obligation to be gentle, that the law, when defied, could take everything, not just life, but the shape of the human body itself. Real historical cases and victims of the wheel. The breaking wheel was not a myth. It was not folklore. It was real, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people were sentenced to die on it. Some of these victims were murderers, rapists, or bandits. Others were political rebels, religious heretics, or simply people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let us now explore the real human beings, flesh and blood, who met their end beneath the wheel. Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg, 1589. One of the most infamous cases of execution by breaking wheel was that of Peter Stump, a German farmer from the town of Bedburg, near Cologne. Stump was accused of being a werewolf. Yes, a werewolf. In 1589, he was arrested during a wave of hysteria that gripped the Rhineland. He was accused of witchcraft, cannibalism, incest, and the brutal murder of more than a dozen people, including his own son. Under torture, he confessed to making a pact with the devil, who gave him a magical belt that transformed him into a wolf. He allegedly roamed the countryside, killing livestock and children, tearing them apart with his bare hands and teeth. On October 31, 1589, his sentence was carried out publicly. It was deliberately cruel. He was tied to the wheel and had flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers. Then his limbs were broken with the wheel. Finally, his head was cut off and his body was burned. His daughter and mistress were executed alongside him. The wheel here was more than punishment, it was theatrical terror. An entire town gathered to watch. The execution was meant to expel evil, to cleanse sin, to warn the people that the devil walks among them, and that the church would not show mercy. Matthias Klostermaier, the Bavarian Robin Hood, 1771. Matthias Klostermaier, also known as the Bavarian Hyacil, was a legendary outlaw in southern Germany. Like a German Robin Hood, he robbed tax collectors, noblemen, and merchants, distributing the loot among the poor peasants of Bavaria. He was clever, elusive, and popular among the people, and that made him dangerous to the authorities. Captured in 1771, Klostermaier was accused of robbery, murder, and insurrection. Though he had a loyal following, the court wanted to make an example out of him. He was sentenced to be broken on the wheel. But not just any breaking. His sentence included 42 blows, an unthinkably brutal number, and no final mercy stroke. The goal was to prolong his death as long as possible, to make him suffer publicly, and to erase any romantic legend around his name. According to eyewitnesses, he took nearly 2 full hours to die. His screams could be heard far from the town square. People wept. Some vomited. His body was left displayed on the wheel, hung high in the air, twisted and swollen, as a warning to any who dared to rebel. Catherine de Chaise, the poisoner Lavoisin, 1680. In France, the wheel was not only reserved for men. One of the most notorious women executed on the wheel was Catherine Monvoisin, known as Lavoisin. She was a central figure in the affair of the poisons, a major scandal during the reign of Louis XIV. She was accused of selling love potions, poisons, and performing black masses for wealthy clients, including members of the royal court. Although she was burned at the stake, some of her accomplices, especially men involved in murder or satanic rituals, were broken on the wheel. One such man was Adam Lesage, a sorcerer and poisoner. After his confession of multiple murders through poison, he was sentenced to the wheel. His limbs were shattered, his body braided into the spokes, and his remains left outside Paris. Lavoisin's trial revealed a hidden world of aristocratic vice, religious hypocrisy, and state cruelty. The wheel became a symbol not just of justice, but of spectacle, control, and power. The 4 regicides of Poland, 1665. In Poland, the breaking wheel was used to punish high treason. In 1665, 4 noblemen conspired to assassinate King John II Casimir. The plot failed. The punishment was swift and brutal. Each man was tied to a separate wheel, and their bones were broken methodically. The execution was carried out in front of the royal palace, with the king himself watching. The people were ordered to attend. This public execution was more than justice. It was politics. By using the wheel, the monarch displayed his absolute authority. The blood and screams of the traitors sent a message. Defiance would be met not just with death, but with annihilation. The peasant revolt of 1525, mass executions. During the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, tens of thousands of peasants rose up against feudal oppression, inspired in part by the Protestant Reformation. After the revolt was crushed, retribution was savage. In some towns, the leaders of the rebellion were sentenced to the wheel. They were executed one after another, publicly, over several days. Entire communities were forced to watch as their neighbors and friends were tied down, shattered, and left to die. The breaking wheel, in this case, served as a collective punishment, a terror weapon used by the ruling class to stamp out the dream of social equality. These were not isolated cases. The breaking wheel was used across France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and beyond, from the 13th century all the way into the early 19th century. Hundreds of names have been recorded. Countless others have been lost. And though their crimes varied, theft, murder, rebellion, heresy, their final moments were eerily similar. Bound to wood, bones crushed one by one, life draining slowly into the dust, the wheel creaking beneath them. To modern eyes, the breaking wheel seems barbaric, a grotesque theater of cruelty. But to medieval and early modern societies, it was something more, a calculated instrument of order, morality, and divine justice. So why did it persist for so long? Why was this nightmarish execution method not just tolerated, but celebrated in courts, churches, and public squares? To understand the popularity of the breaking wheel, we must first understand the psychology of punishment, and the world that created it. 1. Justice as spectacle. In medieval Europe, justice was not hidden behind courtroom doors. It was public, dramatic, and deeply symbolic. Trials were open. Sentences were read aloud. Executions were civic rituals, meant to be watched, remembered, and feared. The wheel was perfect for this. It turned death into a performance, one that unfolded slowly, often over hours. The crowd didn't just witness death. They witnessed pain, step by step. Each blow of the iron bar, each crack of bone, each scream from the condemned served as a moral sermon. Authorities believed, if punishment was visible, it would prevent others from sinning. Thus, the wheel wasn't just a killing device. It was theater, and every village was the audience. 2. Divine retribution. Justice wasn't merely a human concept, it was divine. The Church taught that God's will was expressed through earthly punishment. When a criminal was broken on the wheel, it was not simply man punishing man, it was God punishing evil. Especially for crimes seen as unnatural, such as parricide, sorcery, heresy, or treason, the wheel allowed the punishment to mirror the sin. A traitor who tore apart the body of the state had his body torn apart. A sorcerer who perverted nature was perverted in form. A murderer who caused agony died in agony. Breaking the body was seen as a kind of ritual cleansing, where evil was purged through pain. And if the condemned repented in the final moments, it was even believed that their soul could still be saved. The wheel became a path to redemption through suffering. 3. The symbolism of the wheel. The wheel wasn't chosen at random. In ancient and medieval symbolism, the wheel represented fate, divine order, and the cycle of life. Think of the wheel of fortune. One moment you're on top, the next you're crushed beneath. By using a literal wheel to execute criminals, societies reinforce the idea that fate turns, and that the wicked fall. But more than that, the wheel elevated the punishment physically. The broken bodies were often tied to the wheel and hoisted on poles, visible for miles, left for days or weeks as carrion for crows. It was a warning in the sky. No one could pass without seeing the twisted corpse, bones like crooked branches, skull bleached in the sun. This high display wasn't accidental. It was intentional propaganda. Crime leads to ruin, rebellion leads to agony, and justice is absolute. 4. Political control. The wheel was especially popular during times of social unrest. In periods of rebellion, the Peasants' War, the Reformation, the French Wars of Religion, rulers turned to extreme punishment as a tool of fear. Public executions with the wheel weren't just about justice. They were about control. By making the punishment excruciating, authorities hoped to destroy not just the individual, but the idea they represented. The wheel shattered the body, yes, but it also shattered hope, protest, resistance. It said, "This is what happens to those who rise up." And in this way, the wheel became a tool of the powerful, a weapon not just of punishment, but of power. 5. a society without prisons. It's easy to forget that before the 19th century, most countries did not have a prison system as we know it today. There were no long-term sentences for most crimes. Jail was for holding, not punishing. Execution was the punishment. In that world, the choice wasn't between the wheel and prison. It was between the wheel and quick beheading, or burning, or hanging. And so, for the worst crimes, crimes that shocked the conscience of society, the wheel was chosen. It was slow, shameful, and total. 6. Entertainment and catharsis. As cruel as it sounds, executions were a form of public entertainment. People brought their children. Vendors sold food. Songs were written about famous executions. In a world without movies or mass media, the wheel provided a visceral drama, one that reaffirmed morality, punished evil, and satisfied bloodlust. It was horrible, yes, but it was also fascinating. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. The breaking wheel lasted not just because kings and judges wanted it, but because the people did. 7. The illusion of justice. In theory, the wheel was reserved for the worst of the worst. But in reality, innocent people were sometimes broken, or people who committed petty crimes, or political enemies. Torture was often used to extract confessions. Trials were unfair. Evidence was non-existent. And once accused, it was almost impossible to escape the wheel's embrace. Thus, the popularity of the wheel reveals something tragic. It was not about justice. It was about order. It was about fear. And it was about control. For centuries, the breaking wheel maintained its hold on Europe, not because it was effective, but because it was believed to be just. It turned the body into a message. It turned pain into proof. And it turned death into a symbol of power. Despite its horrific nature, the breaking wheel was not outlawed in a single revolutionary act. Its disappearance was slow, scattered, and uneven, reflecting deeper shifts in European society. The wheel didn't vanish because people suddenly grew merciful. It vanished because the world changed. This is the story of how one of history's most monstrous punishments was finally buried, not with outrage, but with indifference and decay. 1. Enlightenment and the War on Cruelty. By the early 18th century, whispers of reform were spreading across Europe. Philosophers and jurists, many part of the growing Enlightenment movement, began questioning the entire justice system. They saw torture and public executions not as divine justice, but as barbaric remnants of a darker age. One of the loudest voices was Cesare Beccaria, whose 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments declared that punishment should be swift, certain, and proportional, not public agony. He argued that cruel punishments did not deter crime, they corrupted society, turning justice into spectacle and citizens into voyeurs. Beccaria's ideas swept through Europe's intellectual circles like wildfire. Monarchs seeking to appear modern, such as Frederick the Great of Prussia or Joseph II of Austria, began quietly reducing the use of torture and limiting the wheel to only the most extreme cases. But in the countryside, things moved more slowly. 2. Rural brutality persists. While cities embraced reform, rural courts clung to the old ways. In small towns and villages, the breaking wheel continued to serve as a tool of fear and tradition. Executioners were often local legends. The wheel was a known ritual. It wasn't questioned, it was expected. And the people still came to watch. In fact, some of the most gruesome documented uses of the wheel happened after Beccaria's writings. In 1757, the Frenchman Robert-François Damiens was publicly broken on the wheel in Paris after attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. The ordeal included burning flesh with sulfur, pouring molten lead into wounds, and drawing and quartering. In 1766, in Hesse, Germany, Anna Goldie, falsely accused of witchcraft, was sentenced to die by the wheel, though her sentence was reduced to decapitation. Reform may have been fashionable in court, but in practice, old habits died hard. 3. The executioner's decline. Another reason the wheel faded was practical. Executioners began disappearing. These men, often feared, sometimes shunned, were trained in specialized techniques passed down through generations. But as public executions declined, so did the prestige and need for skilled executioners. By the late 1700s, many cities abolished the wheel simply because no one knew how to do it properly anymore. And when botched executions turned into horrific public failures, with criminals surviving the breaking or dying too quickly, even traditionalists began to question its effectiveness. The age of science and progress had no place for the butcher's theater of the wheel. 4. The French Revolution and the guillotine. Then came the Revolution. In 1789, France exploded in blood and ideology. The breaking wheel, once a symbol of royal justice, became a hated relic of monarchical cruelty. Revolutionaries demanded equality in death, and introduced the guillotine, a device designed to be swift, painless, and democratic. No more slow deaths for commoners and quick beheadings for nobles. Everyone would die the same. With this, the wheel was officially abolished in France in 1791. Other countries soon followed, if more slowly. In Prussia, the wheel was still in use until the early 1800s. In Bavaria, it lasted until 1813. Some parts of Switzerland used it until 1820. But after that, it became extinct. The last legal use of the breaking wheel in Germany is believed to have occurred in 1841, a grim final gasp of a dying punishment. 5. The wheel becomes a memory. By the mid-19th century, the breaking wheel had transformed from a living punishment into a historical curiosity. It appeared in museums, in old court records, in Gothic novels. Artists painted scenes of its horror. Scholars debated its meaning. Tourists gawked at old execution wheels still hanging in churches or castles. But the moral horror took longer to settle in. Only in the 20th century did Europe begin to view the breaking wheel with the same disgust we now feel. It wasn't just seen as outdated, it was seen as inhuman. No justice system could claim to be modern or moral while endorsing a punishment that turned the body into a public ruin. And so, it passed into the graveyard of history, alongside the Iron Maiden, the rack, and the stake. 6. Modern echoes. But the story doesn't quite end there. In parts of the world, echoes of the wheel's brutality still linger. In some extremist regimes, criminals are still tortured in ways that resemble wheel breaking, limbs crushed, bodies displayed. In popular culture, the wheel appears in films, horror games, and dark fantasy novels, a symbol of sadism, power, and ancient wrath. And in debates over modern justice, the legacy of the wheel still haunts us. How much suffering is just? What does a society reveal when it punishes? And how close are we, really, to the edge of cruelty? The breaking wheel is gone. But its shadow remains. Because while the device was wood and iron, the real machinery, the hunger for pain, the need for power, the belief that violence can bring order, still runs through the darker corners of civilization. And perhaps that is the wheel that never truly stops turning. These names, Stump, Lavoisin, Clostermare, are only the few who history remembered. Tens of thousands more were broken in anonymity. Thieves, rebels, beggars, heretics, lovers, soldiers, children. Each one a body on a wheel, each one erased from the records. And in that forgetting lies a final cruelty. Because the breaking wheel didn't just destroy bodies. It erased people. It made them into warnings. It turned pain into law. Part 7. The Wheel in the Witch Hunts and Moral Crusades. By the early modern period, the breaking wheel had become deeply entwined not just with criminal justice but with the ideological battles that defined Europe's religious and political crises. It was no longer only murderers and highwaymen who faced this agony, but heretics, witches, and political dissidents. The witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries were particularly brutal chapters in this saga. As mass hysteria swept across Germany, France, and other regions, countless individuals, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft based on little more than suspicion, hearsay, or malice. Though burning at the stake is the most widely remembered punishment for witchcraft, the breaking wheel was also employed, often in cases where the accused was said to have consorted with the devil or caused multiple deaths through black magic. One notorious case occurred in Würzburg, Germany, where entire families were executed during a wave of witch persecutions. Accusations spiraled out of control, and even children were implicated. Those deemed especially dangerous were first broken on the wheel to purge their evil through physical torment before being burned. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Breaking the body would cleanse the soul. The wheel also appeared in the persecution of Anabaptists and other non-conforming religious groups. Authorities in both Protestant and Catholic regions used brutal methods to maintain religious orthodoxy. Dissenters were frequently labeled as threats not just to the faith, but to the entire social order. The breaking wheel, with its slow and public destruction of the human form, sent a message. Defiance would be crushed completely, physically and spiritually. In some cases, the condemned were given a mercy blow, a strike to the chest or head meant to end their life quickly before the full breaking commenced. But this was not always granted, and in many instances, the process was deliberately drawn out to maximize terror. The line between justice and spectacle had long since disappeared. The wheel was now a weapon in moral crusades, a visible, grotesque demonstration of divine and legal wrath. These public executions served a dual purpose, punishing the individual and reaffirming the dominant worldview. To witness a human being broken alive was to internalize a lesson. This is what happens to those who oppose the laws of God, king, and country. The crowds came not only for blood, but for reassurance that their world, harsh, hierarchical, and merciless, was being kept intact by brutal justice. As the Enlightenment began to dawn, cracks started to form in this logic. Philosophers and reformers began to question whether such cruelty truly served justice or merely indulged sadism cloaked in legal robes. Yet in many corners of Europe, the breaking wheel continued to spin. Its creaking echoes were not yet silenced by reason or compassion. Part 8. The Final Revolutions of the Wheel. By the 18th century, as the Age of Enlightenment gained momentum, Europe's intellectual and moral climate began to shift. Voices like Voltaire, Beccaria, and Montesquieu decried the cruelty of torture and execution. They argued that justice should be rational, proportionate, and humane, not a theater of pain. In 1764, Cesare Beccaria's treatise on crimes and punishments denounced torture as barbaric and ineffective, challenging the very foundations of the punitive systems that had relied on spectacle. Public sentiment began to change. The wheel, once cheered in public squares, now evoked unease. Its moral legitimacy began to erode. But the transition was slow. In parts of France and Germany, the breaking wheel remained legal until the late 1700s. Some of its last victims were executed during the chaos following uprisings, rebellion, and famine. One of the final recorded uses in France was in 1789, the very year the French Revolution began. The storming of the Bastille symbolized more than the collapse of monarchy, it was the beginning of the end for judicial torture. Revolutionary ideals swept aside old codes and customs. The guillotine, though a tool of death, was hailed as swift and humane compared to the wheel's prolonged suffering. In that comparison, even death by decapitation seemed merciful. Across Europe, criminal codes were revised. The wheel disappeared from legal texts, not because it had lost its power, but because its power was no longer wanted. Civilization, it was said, had outgrown the need to crush bodies in the public square. But the memory remained. Part 9. Legacy of the Wheel. Though abolished, the wheel's legacy lingers in culture, metaphor, and cautionary tales. In some languages, phrases like "broken on the wheel" still evoke the idea of total, merciless defeat. Literature, films, and art occasionally resurrect its image to symbolize tyranny, pain, and lost justice. Historically, the breaking wheel represents more than just a method of execution. It symbolizes the raw, unchecked intersection of state power, religious dogma, and public complicity. It exposes how entire societies can participate in or tolerate cruelty when it is framed as righteousness. The wheel reminds us of how justice can be twisted into punishment, and how punishment can become performance. It stands as a warning from history, that when pain becomes policy, the human soul itself is broken. Even now, in a world that claims to have moved beyond such savagery, echoes of the wheel remain, in torture chambers, in state-sanctioned violence, and in the many ways societies still break people without steel or spokes. The wheel no longer turns. But the lessons it leaves behind still revolve in the conscience of history.